Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Edward Luce celebrating the release of the book Zbig. This new sweeping biography of former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski has been called a brilliant study of an American statesman, as well as an astonishing biography that will change the way history looks at Brzezinski and the Cold War. The Guardian calls this book deeply and meticulously researched, an embracing tome even at 562 pages, a highly readable reminder of how the US and global politics looked and felt before the Cold War ended. Edward Luce is the Financial Times' chief U.S. commentator and columnist. He is the author of 3 acclaimed books, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, Time to Start Thinking Again, America in the Age of Dissent, and In Spite of the Gods, The Strange Rise of Modern India. He appears regularly on CNN, NPR, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and the BBC. He lives in Washington, D.C. Luce will be in conversation with Kori Schake. Schake is a senior fellow and the director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI. Before joining this institution, Dr. Schake was the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She has worked at the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, the National Security Council at the White House, and has been published in CNN, Foreign Affairs, Politico, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and is a contributing writer at The Atlantic. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose tonight's guests.
So it is such a joy to have the fun of grilling my good friend Ed Luce about this book. And I want to start, Ed, by asking what the motivation was it for writing the book was, because I think I see a trajectory in your work since about 2012, in which you started worrying about America's role in the international order and then about the West writ large. And this feels like you reaching back to a time when American government leaders were statesmen. Did it feel like that to you?
That's not a loaded question at all, but I do agree with the premise. First of all, thank you, Kori. It's a delight to have you here. Thank you to Politics and Prose. My first book that was just mentioned, In Spite of the Gods, was launched from here, so I consider myself I haven't launched a book until it's been at Politics and Prose.
Okay, I hate to interrupt, but we buried the lead. Ed's book has just come out on the New York Times bestseller list. A remarkable achievement for so serious a book.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's only at number 15, so I have to drive it up. But I did tell Kori that before, and she said that's a really privileged complaint to make.
It's a pretty high-class problem to complain about where on the New York Times bestseller list your book has landed. I feel like let that go.
So for sure, I mean, your question, what motivated me to write this? You're right. I mean, I wrote a fairly bleak book about the condition of US democracy and the middle class, which I believe are linked, in 2012, long before Trump descended that escalator, but a year after, you were probably there, I was there at the White House Correspondents' Dinner where Obama deservedly humiliated Trump for saying Obama was born in Kenya and was therefore not eligible to be president. So actually, it was a year after, in Trump's head, he was going to be president. But the reason for doing this book is that during COVID, I mean, I wasn't tapping my fingers, but you know, there was a more sort of time use challenge problem, and the family came to me. They'd come to me before COVID, but they came insistently during COVID. The family being Ian, Mark, and Mika, the 3 children of Brzezinski, and said, look, here are these diaries that he kept, that he used a dictaphone to keep. He spoke in complete paragraphs every night on the way home from the White House to McLean, Virginia, and read them and tell us what you think, because they're yours without strings attached if you are interested in writing a biography of our father. And I started reading them and getting more and more addicted, because I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now the 70s and the 1970s was a geopolitical decade, and we are now living in the era of the revenge of geopolitics. And, you know, there was Panama, Carter gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. There was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There was the Soviet non-invasion of Poland. There was the nuclear arms talks. There was China normalization. All these big debates that have very strange echoes for today. And two things occurred to me. One is there had not been a big biography in the English language of Brzezinski. And, you know, he was always overshadowed by Henry Kissinger, but they were in the same category. And by the way, I have to say this one thing. I know you're about to ask a question, but interviews I did with Kissinger before he died, obviously, for this book.
It'd be pretty impressive if you interviewed him after he died.
Well, you know, we live in Georgetown next to the Church of Two Worlds, and that's where people communicate. So I could have got a Ouija board, but I didn't try that. I said to Kissinger, so where would you rank Brzezinski in terms of sort of American strategists, geopolitical strategists of the 20th century, the Cold War and beyond? And he said, I'd put him in the top 2. Wow. So I'm trying to think who number one might be.
We know who the other one Kissinger would put in that category is, do we not?
And the second reason is, although I did this with the day job, the cliche, the Churchill cliche, the further back you look, the further forward you can see, is very true. It really helped me with my day job to be researching this stuff. It really helped.
So I want to pick up on the Kissinger-Brzezinski parallel, because you bring out so nicely in the book the way that Kissinger believed Soviet power was, if not in the ascendance, at least so durable that it had to be accommodated. And in many ways, that's actually Trump administration approach to Russia. But Brzezinski he always believed Soviet power was overestimated, was brittle and fracturing. I remember seeing him on TV in 89 or 90, and it was the first person I heard say, well, the Soviet Union's not going to hold together. They don't speak Soviet, they speak Russian. And talk a little bit more about the kind of different approaches to American foreign policy that Kissinger and Brzezinski represented and actually dueled their entire lives over.
Yeah, and that's one of the really key relationships in the book, the Kissinger-Brzezinski one, which was a frenemyship that spanned almost 7 decades. I mean, it is cinematic in its length. And you go, for a biography, you're reeled in, as I was initially, by that first draft of history, the dictaphone, by the SALT treaties, by the invasion of Afghanistan, etc. But then you have to get to the sources, the formative elements of the person's character. You've got to explain all the private sort of thoughts, and luckily I had the diaries he kept as a child, his mother's diaries, tons of letters, lots of translation, because it was all in Polish. But his motivating boost was Poland. He left Poland when he was 10 in 1938, shortly after the notorious Munich Agreement, when Neville Chamberlain, I guess, bent the knee to Hitler. And from then on, his diary is a chronicle of what happened to his country. And Warsaw was the most destroyed capital, even more than Berlin, of the Second World War, leveled. And he knew the streets, and he was following it. And the early part, the First World War started, the Second World War, of course, started with the invasion of Poland from the west by Nazi Germany, from the east by the Soviet Union. And the first few days, he's writing, he's in a new school, he's learning a new language, he's in Montreal, just arrived, he doesn't speak English, and he's writing a little bit about what's happening, but basically just in detail, this 11-year-old by now, the battles, the weapons, the planes, the Messerschmitts, the Panzer divisions, all of this in great detail. And his father, who was a Polish diplomat, and he would turn the radio on at night. And after a couple of weeks, Radio Warsaw went silent. All they played was every 30 minutes the first 11 notes of a polonaise by Chopin, so a Polish. And after about 3 weeks, that stopped, and it was replaced by Deutschland über alles. And that, to them, even more than the news of what was the sort of inferno that was engulfing their country, that even more, that musical change was a sort of hammer, a guillotine coming down on their lives. And this was a motivating boost. In 1950, he writes his master's thesis at McGill University.
Which is basically the intellectual grounding for his entire remainder of his life, right?
Absolutely. It really has the kernel there that is, and it's called Russo-Soviet Nationalism. Very interesting title, Russo-Soviet Nationalism, because the Sovietologists at that time, who'd quickly come into being, it being the Cold War, the nuclear shadows suddenly emerged. America realizes it has to get up to speed very quickly, which it does with the Cold War University. And he writes this thesis, age 22, in which he identifies the Soviet Union's Achilles heel as being the suppressed nations within it, not just the new sort of captive nations, as they were called, of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, etc., but the nations within the USSR, the Tajiks, the Kazakhs, the Ukrainians. And he details why these people do not see themselves as Soviet citizens. They don't speak Soviet. They see themselves as subjugated by a Russian empire dressed in Marxist clothing. And that was an insight that other Sovietologists didn't have. And of course it links to his biography as a Pole.
So one of the things that you bring out so beautifully in the book is how funny he was. And I love the story you tell about how at one point President Carter asked for like a capsule explanation of Soviet history. And he says, with Lenin, it was a revival meeting; with Stalin, a prison; with Khrushchev, a circus; and with Brzezinski, the U.S. Post Office. How did he come to Carter's attention? How did he, a professor at Columbia, get chosen as national security advisor?
It's a really good question, and it very much differentiates that time from this time, because in a weird way, Brzezinski chose Carter. So in 1968, Brzezinski had been foreign policy issues director for Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon won. Kissinger had not been Nixon's foreign policy director. He'd been Nelson Rockefeller's. Then he'd offered his services to Hubert Humphrey, and Zbig had said no, because their rivalry was, already well developed. But then Nixon offered him the job, and from that moment onwards, he believed that if this foreign accented academic can make it to the top, and it wasn't just that Kissinger was offered to be national security advisor, it was plenipotentiary, with the Secretary of State being an afterthought. Then Brzezinski developed that. And so when the 72 election came round, everybody sort of vied for Brzezinski's services. Hubert Humphrey wanted to run again. Ed Muskie approached him. Udall, Ted Kennedy, who then didn't end up running. But all the wannabe Democratic candidates approached Brzezinski because he was the Democratic Kissinger. And obviously Carter didn't run then. It was a disastrous McGovern defeat to Nixon. And then immediately afterwards, Brzezinski's selecting one Republican and one Democratic governor to join the Trilateral Commission, which he'd formed as a rival to Bilderberg, which of course was Kissinger's playground, with David Rockefeller's backing, not Nelson's. I mean, they each had a Rockefeller. There's sort of a Medici theme here. And they selected Carter. He selected Carter, and Carter used the Trilateral Commission as his crash course in foreign affairs, in global affairs, to prepare for his 76 run. But he kept saying during 76, I am an eager student of Zbig. And Brzezinski said, look, Governor Carter, and then later, because he kept saying it when he was president, he kept saying that the American people do not want to elect a student. They want to elect a leader. So could you please stop saying that? But it's an incredibly different, a measure of quite what a different time it was, that presidents or presidential aspirants looked for grand strategists to associate themselves with, because it begs the question who they'd be looking for today.
So Brzezinski's right about the Soviet Union and wants to assist the pace of their collapse. But probably the most consequential move in grand strategy was cementing the relationship with China, turning it from a sort of three-legged stool in the way Kissinger had envisioned to a U.S., Chinese, a Sino-American, anti-Soviet group. Talk about the remarkable relationship he creates with Deng Xiaoping and how that plays out.
So, of course, the opening to China was Nixon, Kissinger in the Shanghai communique several years before. And that people expected that to result in US-China normalization. It didn't, partly because Watergate just consumed Nixon's bandwidth, partly because Kissinger's counterpart, Zhou Enlai, was ailing, and Nixon's counterpart, Mao, was also ailing, both of whom died. And so Kissinger was left sort of holding the baby, and there was just no progress. So it started going into reverse, which we sort of forget. 74, 75, 76, US-China relations start sort of going almost back to the pre-Shanghai communique. And then Carter's elected, and Zbig pushes aggressively for normalization as the key move on the chessboard. Against Cy Vance, Carter's Secretary of State, who thought it would undermine the Soviet appetite to negotiate SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And eventually Zbig gets his way, and really he gets along with Deng Xiaoping like Kissinger got along with Zhou Enlai, because Deng Xiaoping is blunt, completely anti-Soviet. They can sort of, even though they have interpreters, finish each other's sentences. And to the extent where normalization happens and Deng becomes the first Chinese leader in history to visit the United States of America. And the first night he spends not at the White House, but at Zbig's home in McLean, being served food cooked by Muska, Zbig's wife, and the food is served by Ian, Mark, and Mika. Really, really odd to imagine any other president. This isn't so much about Brzezinski as about Carter. Any other president, and so it's not about Trump even, it's about Carter tolerating this amazing historic moment not happening at the White House. Next night was the state dinner. But, biography is full of amusing personal moments. And Mika spills the caviar. Well, Dobrynin, the legendary Soviet ambassador, had sent Brzezinski vodka and caviar that Christmas, as he always did. And so he and Deng toasted each other with Soviet vodka, Russian vodka. And Mika, 11-year-old Mika, spills the caviar into Deng Xiaoping's lap, a whole dollop of it, and gets really, really sort of nervous about it and gets a napkin and starts rubbing his groin. So there was nearly a diplomatic incident. There is another with Mika. She almost ran over Menachem Begin at the Camp David talks, but that's a whole other story.
So I do actually want to move to the Camp David Accords. This is going to be a very foreign policy heavy conversation between us, given Brzezinski's responsibilities. The most the most celebrated achievement of the Carter administration was the Camp David Accords. And it's my favorite part of the book because it's such an intimate portrait you tell about the ease with which Carter got along with Sadat and the difficulty with Begin. You even point out that Carter means as an insult saying that Brzezinski is actually a lot like Begin, right? Like untrustworthy, Machiavellian, and Brzezinski takes it as a compliment, although it's not meant as one. Talk a little bit more about how they made that magnificent achievement come together.
So this is Carter. I mean, it's Carter who decides. He's a Sunday school preacher. He's many things, but one of the things he is a Sunday school preacher, and he's also got a slightly less stellar record on civil rights as a New South governor of Georgia than his reputation, at least in the way he campaigned for the governorship. So it's on his conscience, and he transfers that conscience to the Palestinians. And he wants to resolve the strife in the biblical homelands, in the biblical territories. And so he really drives that. And Vance and Brzezinski are with him completely. Brzezinski's motive is very different. He sees that seducing the Arab world is a Cold War move. So he's instrumentalist.
Soviet influence in Egypt and other places.
Exactly. And Carter cannot stand Begin. He keeps trying with Begin, but Begin's obdurate. He's a very stubborn, he's hardline. And Sadat is this romantic who makes these sort of wild gestures that eventually get him killed for allegedly betraying the Arab cause. It does get him killed, and everybody was aware at the time that he was actually risking his life. Begin just wouldn't move. And so Carter sort of saw this, on the one hand, this romantic risk taker, Sadat, and on the other hand, this Dr. No, who just said no to everything. And Brzezinski and Begin, of course, were both raised in Poland in very different milieu. Begin being Jewish, Polish, and Brzezinski not. But they spoke Polish to each other. Actually, there's a wonderful story of them playing chess at Camp David, which Brzezinski details in the diaries, and they played 4 games. He claims he won 3-1, and Begin claims he won 3-1. And I established in a piece of amazing historic sleuthing that it was 2-2. But he says to him at the beginning of the game, to Brzezinski, the last time I played was in 1940. And it was interrupted by the NKVD, the Soviet police who arrested me. And during the game, and I think it was a classic game where Brzezinski had brought out his queen too early, and therefore he lost that game. Mrs. Begin comes out and goes, my husband's always playing chess. So it was a classic thing. But he became the Begin whisperer. And there were a lot of allegations against Brzezinski of anti-Semitism. Partly because he still had a Polish accent, and Poland's history is as bad as it gets. But and also because he was an advocate himself for what we now call a two-state solution. And when Begin arrived for the first time in the US in July 1977, first time Likud had won the elections ever in Israel, he invited Brzezinski to Blair House, where he was staying with the cameras, and he presented him with this thing from the Golden Notebook of Jerusalem, which was commemorating Brzezinski's father, a diplomat, Polish diplomat, for having given lots of exit visas and passports to Jews in Poland when he was the consul general in Leipzig in the early Nazi era. So Begin really threw Brzezinski a solid there, and that sort of cemented his status as but I don't want to give the impression this is a hagiography. I mean, Brzezinski really screwed up on Iran, for example.
We're going to get to that, but before we get to that, talk about his relationship with Pope John Paul II, because it was such an interesting part of the book, the way that plays into changes in Poland?
Yeah, so Brzezinski had met this prelate from Poland before. Pope John Paul, what person who became Pope John Paul II, was very interested in Polish freedom. And that was linked inextricably with the Catholic Church's freedom in Poland. And so Brzezinski had met him, didn't know him that well, but they'd had a long, long conversation in Polish, of course. And suddenly, late 1978, we get the first non-Italian pope in 453 years. Hasn't been an Italian pope since then, by the way. It's like long unbroken run, and then it's a fallow patch for the Italians. But that was the first Polish pope, and they got to know each other very well. And Brzezinski would say that the Pope was more like a world leader, and Carter was more like a pope, a religious leader. But they talked a lot, and I got their correspondence in Polish that was from then, but also went up to 2005 when he died. And so I had this translated as a really fascinating correspondence. And they talked so much that the phone that Brzezinski had in the White House, he had a P for Pope on it. So he just pressed P, and some Monsignor in the Vatican would pick it up and pass it on to the Pope. And they together, I think, were really quite pivotal in preventing the Soviet invasion of Poland. Because you'd had Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia 1968, and then Poland, a far, far more mortal threat to the Soviet system. Because this solidarity movement, which began in August 1980, by the end of 1980, had 10 million members. Almost a third of Poland's population. Extraordinary, wildcat sort of spread, organic and wildfire, rather. I mean, it was just an enormous threat because it was a trade union which went straight at the Marxian jugular, a trade union whose hero was the Pope. They just couldn't decode this. And so they posted 18 divisions, the Soviets. They built hospital camps. They were ready to invade, 18 divisions. Almost 200,000 men were ready to invade, of which 2 of those divisions were German. Now think of this. This is 40 years after Russia and Germany invaded Poland, and they were ready to do it again. And together, the Pope and Brzezinski managed to make Poland look indigestible. That you've got the workers, you've got the intellectuals, and the church. You had one of those 3 with the Hungarians and the Czechs. You basically had the intellectuals. You've got all 3 here. You really think, and you probably the army. And then the final thing of that, which is almost the most fascinating, is another Pole, Stanislaw Kuklinski, the most valuable asset, I think, or at least one of the top 2 or 3 that the CIA ever had behind the Iron Curtain, who was a Polish liaison between the Polish General Chiefs of Staff and the Soviet one. So he was getting all the Soviet invasion plans because the Soviets assumed the Polish military would be with them, and he was sending them straight through this very complex pickup thing. He had a cyanide pill, by the way. And they went to Langley, and Brzezinski got it raw. He didn't want any analyst's interpretation, didn't want any translations. He wanted it raw in the Polish. And so they got all the data they needed. And he understood exactly what was about to happen, and he made Poland look like a porcupine. You're not going to digest this. And that's the Pope and Brzezinski, the accident of having 2 Polish speakers in these roles for the first and so far last time. The serendipity is remarkable, quite remarkable.
So Panama is much in the news these days. And President Carter's return of the Panama Canal to Panamanian control was such a sort of shock to how the United States looked to the countries of our hemisphere. Talk about Brzezinski's role in that. How does that connect to how he thought about the world more broadly?
This is a great question. I mean, this is the only other area I can think of where Carter, Brzezinski, Vance were all lined up in the same direction. Carter, again, because it was the right thing to do. He felt that, America was being imperialist. Vance, again, he was a gentleman. He was one of the last of the WASPs, really. And Brzezinski, because he wanted to kill the Monroe Doctrine. Why did he want to kill the Monroe Doctrine? Because he didn't think anybody should have a Monroe Doctrine, including the Soviets, that you don't have any sphere of influence. That's not justice. And therefore, we needed to prove. Really, this was Carter's thing, and Brzezinski was brought in to sell it to the massively skeptical Congress. I mean, it was a feat for Carter to even attempt to get 2/3 vote for 2 treaties. So twice 2/3 votes in the Senate for something that Ronald Reagan and others were saying was the new Munich or the new Yalta. I mean, there was all kinds of rhetoric that this was like America being weak and we would be exploited. And Carter managed to just drive this through. But Brzezinski helped sell it because Brzezinski was the hawk. He was the one who could explain it in hard-nosed national interest ways. And he was not a fan of the Monroe Doctrine at all, because by extension, that means everybody else can oppress people.
This comes through so nicely in the book, the way that for him, the Monroe Doctrine legitimated a Soviet sphere of influence. And not only did he think we should be better than that, he actually thought we shouldn't be giving the Soviets any of that kind of legitimation. I thought that was one of the nicest points you made in the book. So to people who who haven't yet read the book, they may be asking the question, if Zbigniew Brzezinski is such a brilliant strategist, how come Carter administration foreign policy is seen in such a derisory light? And a big part of the answer has to be Iran. Talk about Brzezinski's advocacy of the hostage rescue and what that does to his standing in the administration.
Yeah, I mean, it's the seminal mistake. It did contribute arguably decisively to Carter's defeat to Reagan. There are a couple of other factors: high inflation, appointing Paul Volcker, who'd pushed interest rates up to 20%. But Iran and the sort of that nightly thing, 444 days of captivity, and Ted Koppel and Walter Cronkite and people like that having that clock every night. It was a sort of sword of Damocles over Carter that he couldn't fix. And there are stories within stories there that are controversial. But I think Brzezinski, so he was too old to do an in-person interview, but I did do a written interview with Carter, and it was him who was writing or dictating the responses. And he said the worst piece of advice Zbig was ever gave me was on Iran. The best, he said, was on China, by the way, but the worst was on Iran. And that was 2 parts. One was admitting the Shah. So the Shah had obviously fled into exile. He had cancer. He had terminal cancer, lymphoma, that the Americans didn't know about. The CIA had not picked up on this. The French knew it because French doctors were treating the Shah, but they hadn't bothered to pass this on whilst the Shah was still Shah, which kind of explained his unwillingness to crack down on the mullahs. And so it then became a big campaign to admit the Shah for treatment in the United States on the false premise that he could only be treated in the United States. He could actually have been treated in many, many places. But the mistake Brzezinski made was having persuaded Carter that the Shah should not renounce the peacock throne as a condition of his asylum, because the Iranians had legitimate paranoia. Remember, the British and the Americans had overthrown Mossadegh in 1953 to impose the same Shah back on the throne. So they had reasons for paranoia. So that was the first mistake. And then the second And that, of course, triggered the takeover of the embassy and the hostage crisis, helped trigger it. And the second was more than a year later when this rescue mission was devised by the Pentagon. Brzezinski really didn't know much about the logistics of military operations. And he accepted the Pentagon's remarkable confidence in what was a harebrained, I mean, this is nuts. 48 hours, 4 different staging posts. This was not Entebbe, which was 2 hours, an airport in, out. This is like 4 staging posts, 1 night in the desert, and then you rescue 50 people from the middle of this big city, Tehran. You take them to this disused sports stadium where there's helicopters that somehow got in unnoticed that go to another place in the desert where you wait during the day for the night to fall. And then finally, during the next night, 48 hours after it began, fly them out. One thing goes wrong, the whole thing goes wrong. And of course, it went wrong at Desert One before it even really began. None of the people involved, because this was multi-agency, multi-service, had met each other. They hadn't done a dress rehearsal because the desire for secrecy prevented that from happening. And so, Brzezinski blamed the military for the rest of his life, and he would actually screen out military applicants to his classes because he felt so sort of bitter about that. But he bears a lot of the responsibility for it. I'd say the Pentagon bear more because they were so confident.
So 2 quick points before I ask my last question. So the rest of the time is going to be for your questions. So please start thinking, and there's a microphone to line up by. One reaction is, I worry a little bit about the characterization of Brzezinski as a brilliant grand strategist when he knew so little about military issues, which are a pretty big constituent part of that job. But the second thing that comes through, you didn't mention it just now, but it comes through for me really strongly in the book, is how much he believed there was a Soviet hand behind the Iranian Revolution, and the extent to which what was brilliance in his geostrategic thinking led him astray in Iran. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think he was as ignorant about Iran as he was knowledgeable about the Soviet Union. Nobody, though, had a medieval revolution on their bingo card. It's just not what happened. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, it's like you didn't have the Middle Ages coming back to bite you. This was the first religious revolution of our era.
So I'm going to cheat and ask one more question, my friends, because this isn't just a national security book, it's a biography. And the relationships in his family come through so tenderly in the book. Say a little bit about his relationship in particular with his wife.
There's an extraordinary relationship. She was Emily Beneš, Muska, as she became known. She was the grand niece of Edward Beneš, Czechoslovakia's last leader before Munich. And then again after the Second World War, before the Soviets shut down democracy. So a tragic but quite noble family in the Czech history. And she was the grandniece, and she'd also crossed the Atlantic during the Second World War. And in fact, he met her. Brzezinski had been on this sort of frenetic, Brzezinski-esque, targeting women everywhere and getting rejected a lot, but having, I love the language in his diary, necking. There's lots of necking, apparently. That was a thing. And I always think of giraffes, but apparently it was, and then by the 50s, this is Harvard, there's some in English and some in Polish.
Necking was a thing.
In Polish?
No, in English.
It's a very American phrase, yeah.
Well, the translator might have sort of felt there was a Polish necking thing, but no, this is necking in English. And some Polish, though, because, you can't mistranslate neck and then put an ing on the end of it. But the night he met Muska, and that no other woman merits a mention after that, was he went out on a double date with his great friend Sam Huntington, another rising Harvard luminary. And Muska was Huntington's date. And Brzezinski was very uncollegiate that evening, I think it's fair to say. And they developed this relationship. But one of the sort of scoops, there are scoops, different kinds of scoops, or scoops, new things I discovered in this book. And several of them are for the family, things they didn't know. And
At least I hope it's a nice revelation for the family.
Well, this sort of, well, not particularly. I mean, Brzezinski's immediate younger brother, almost a twin, 11 months younger, Adam. They both got polio in Warsaw in the 30s, which was another motivation to cross the Atlantic for the medical treatment. Adam never fully recovered. Brzezinski recovered. Zbigniew recovered. But Adam committed suicide in 1954. He was working on Madison Avenue and stuck his head into a gas oven, turned the gas on, and killed himself. He was gay, he'd never come out, and Brzezinski has to deal with it. But he'd never spoken about it to his family. So all the kids are saying, oh my God, that explains so much. He just refused to talk about it because they were at that point, a very Catholic family. So it was kind of a bombshell, although also an explanatory sort of clearing of vision for the kids and other members of the Brzezinski family. That's one example.
Okay, 2 questions. What have you to ask, Ed?
Thank you so much to both of you for being here today. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent college graduate from the Washington, D.C. area. I'm hoping ultimately to teach history with a focus on human rights issues. And in reading the book, one part of your book that I found particularly moving was reading about, as you mentioned, how Prime Minister Begin presented Brzezinski's father with documentation of his work on behalf of German Jews in Leipzig. I also read that in addition to that, Prime Minister Begin also wrote a letter to Brzezinski's father, formally thanking him for doing this. And he said something like, "The Jewish people, my dear friend." He said something like to the effect of, "The Jewish people never forget a friend." I was wondering what you found most meaningful. I was wondering what you found most moving about Begin's letter to Brzezinski's father, and in what ways you think Brzezinski's father's work to help German Jews in the 1930s impacted his son in the decades to come.
Good question.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point in that brief flowering of Poland's Second Republic between the wars, because it was born in the Treaty of Versailles. It was Woodrow Wilson's 13th point, and it died, of course, in 1939. And early parts of it, Joseph Pilsudski, who was really the father of modern Poland, very progressive figure in our language, believed in a multi-ethnic Poland, including for Jews. By the early 30s, Pilsudski was dying, and a far more unpleasant form of Polish nationalism was rising in Polish politics. And so Brzezinski Sr., Tadeusz Brzezinski's decision to issue these exit visas to so many Jews was not part of Warsaw's policy. And the Third Reich, asked Warsaw to have him recalled. And eventually it did recall him. So that was a big deal in terms of, he did put some skin into the game. He wasn't just being nice on the side. He was actually taking a career risk. And for sure it affected his son. But, there's an old Polish joke that if you've got to fight the Russians and the Germans, who do you fight first? And the joke is, Germans first, Russians second, business before pleasure. Yes. And the Cold War, of course, Germany had ceased to be a threat. So Brzezinski's sort of focus in life was the overarching challenge of his time, which was the Soviet, which came pretty naturally to him as a Pole. I do make the point, though, I really find no evidence he was an anti-Semite. He wasn't even an anti-Zionist. He always believed in the two-state solution as, and then after the Cold War lost context, as the best guarantor of Israel's security.
Next up.
I should say, by the way, I was here during the Carter administration. I graduated from college in 1969. And if they weren't aware of the trouble in Tehran before the Ayatollah came back, they weren't paying attention. I couldn't understand why the U.S. didn't pull all the extra people out of the embassy, because there was a lot of anti-American stuff before he fell, and they missed that somehow. They missed it themselves. I mean, they were right there, but it was in the newspaper every day. My question is, it seemed to me, first of all, like Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski were very much the same, and it turns out their background was the same and in all different ways, and they were Cold Warriors. And I couldn't understand how Carter and Brzezinski managed together, or why Carter chose Brzezinski. They didn't seem to have anything in common at all. Carter was not a Cold Warrior.
Yeah, Carter
he was
not.
But it wasn't important to him.
You're right. I mean, Carter began with, he rejected everybody's advice. Everyone said either choose Vance or Brzezinski. Mm-hmm. And Stu Eisenstadt, who was Carter's head of domestic policy, was one of the people who was very helpful to the book, by the way, one of the people who said one or the other, oil and water. And Carter thought, no, I'll have both of them because I want competing advice and ideas. I want the best range of advice. And I think the way I characterize it is Brzezinski had his head. Carter had a really good brain. And Vance had his heart, and he had a very good heart too. Mm-hmm. And they were in conflict. And reality basically drove things Brzezinski's way. I mean, Brzezinski's best ally in terms of winning arguments was Leonid Brezhnev. The Soviet blundering and sort of adventurism really did invite that sort of mindset.
Can I trample in? Because I also think it's significant that he chooses a posh Columbia professor of international relations who already at that time has an outsized admiration among scholars. Carter's a one-term governor from Georgia with no foreign policy experience. He did it for shielding also.
But there were other, Huntington, just as famous Harvard and Columbia professors. They weren't Cold Warriors.
Fundamentally a conservative, though.
Well, yes, but from an ideological point of view. Well, it was like Carter and Kissinger. It just doesn't make sense.
So, I mean, Brzezinski wasn't a militarist. I mean, he'd made his name as somebody who advocated what he called peaceful engagement. Okay. And that was that and weaponizing Helsinki, which is peaceful engagement, which is human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, catching the Soviets in something they'd signed. Yep. He'd been writing about this as a scholar since the 50s, which is the way to undermine the Soviet Union is peacefully by awakening these nations and people's sense of their own freedom. And so his doctrine wasn't militarist.
I think it actually connects to his opposition to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which is that for Brzezinski, activating the domestic sources of governmental overthrow was what he thought the right strategy was, not the imposition from the outside. Next up.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. One of the things that really struck me in reading the book was how successive presidents of both parties valued Brzezinski's counsel and sought him out, except for George W. Bush. And you don't write very much about that relationship, maybe because there wasn't one. But Was that because of their opposing approaches to strategy, or was this part of the natural arc of Brzezinski's career as he aged?
That's a great question, Kathleen. I mean, he had made himself unpopular with the Bush administration way before the invasion of Iraq. It was after 9/11 with his critique of how the global war on terror was being managed, and his chief criticism was, you are giving carte blanche, you're giving a get out of jail free card to every autocracy in the world to brand their dissidents as terrorists. And we'll accept it's like terrorism, that's a magic word. You can do what you like, including Putin. And he had Putin's number pretty early, well, instantly, in fact. He knew that the guy's grandfather had been Stalin's cook, and that Putin worshipped Stalin, and that when Putin said that the end of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 21st century, he didn't mean the end of Marxism. He meant the end of the Russian Empire. And Brzezinski could read that pretty quickly. And Clinton, not just Bush Jr., but Clinton as well, they both saw Putin as a continuation of the Russian, the evolution of Russian democracy. And so 9/11, he thought, gave these people an excuse to become more autocratic. And that was a really sort of key critique. Then with the Iraq invasion, he and Brent Scowcroft was more dangerous to Bush because he was such friends with his dad and had served his dad. But Kori was in the Pentagon at the time, and she was working, by the way, with alongside Ian Brzezinski, the Republican in the family. So Kori knows a lot more about this, and I'd like to hear your answer.
So my answer is that President Bush was a lot more like President Carter than we often think, in that more of a religious leader than a statesman, because he did view the world fundamentally ideologically in a way that I think Brzezinski was never comfortable with. What comes through in the book is that Brzezinski's ferociously anti-Soviet, but he's not ideological much beyond that. And so it's easy for me to see why they wouldn't mesh. Also, the senior people around President Bush, Condi Rice, deeply ideological. Colin Powell, not somebody that Brzezinski had ever had any tag up with. And Donald Rumsfeld would, trample any plant looking for sunlight. So hard to imagine how that would mesh. In our last couple of minutes, I want to ask more about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and how Brzezinski navigated that, and also the contretemps over going to the Olympics or not going to the Olympics.
Yeah, the Afghanistan thing, it continues to rage as a debate amongst scholars. That some claim that Brzezinski, in a very Machiavellian way, lured the Soviets into invading Afghanistan. And there's lots of sort of superficial pluses to that argument, one of which was that the last Afghan leader, this guy called Amin, who Brezhnev thought was betraying him because he'd overthrown the previous pro-Soviet leader who Brezhnev loved, a guy called Taraki. Amin had studied at Columbia in the 1960s when Brzezinski was the professor there. And he also belonged to a group of Afghan students that it turned out was funded by the CIA. So Brzezinski knew about Soviet paranoia in Afghanistan because there was this rural mullah-led rebellion from the mosques against this secular pro-Soviet government. And the Soviets, he also knew the Soviets were deeply paranoid about their soft underbelly, the south of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, etc. And it would spread, this rebellion. And so he did stoke Soviet paranoia. Brezhnev was drunk most of the time by this point. He was Yeltsin before Yeltsin.
So it's so curious to me that Brzezinski, who had such a strong understanding of the role of religion in countering Soviet expansion in Europe, understood it so little in Afghanistan, and had so little appreciation of the role of religion actually in American foreign policy. In closing, say a little bit about Brzezinski and not ideology, but the role of religion as the kaleidoscope turns on his responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, he was biographically, he was raised a very devout Catholic. And he sort of, the way I think of it is he sort of drifted into church-going agnosticism. And I don't think he was really a believer. And there's no grave. There's no epitaph.
You mentioned he had his ashes scattered in the Virginia forest or something?
In Appalachia, yeah. They didn't because there was, well, yeah, I won't get into that, but because of family. His sense of religion was that it was really part of the past. So he didn't read American politics. And I said he knew the Soviet Union as much as he was ignorant about Iran. He wasn't really very good on American politics either. And he would say to Madeleine Albright, who was very helpful for the book, and who he'd supervised her PhD. He recruited her to the National Security Council, so he was really her mentor. And she was warned, by the way, that Zbig will make you feel small. But he didn't. He really built her up. And he complained to her, why are senators not coming to see me? Why do I have to go and see senators? And she said, because they're elected, Zbig, and you're not. But religion, yeah, he didn't have a reading. It didn't feature. He saw the Soviet Revolution as the danger. He did make up for his lack of grasp of this. I mean, you couldn't Google Shia and Sunni in those days. There was no internet with the Iranian Revolution, but he made up for that the rest of his life. And he led a CFR task force on Iran in the early 2000s, which if the Bush and then Obama administration had taken his advice, I think we'd be a lot better off now. He did get himself up to speed belatedly, but you're right. There's a missing understanding of how religion drives politics in many countries, including parts of the United States.
My friends, won't you join me in thanking this extraordinary author and celebrating this extraordinary book, which he's now going to sign for you?
Thank you.